always a give and take, and yes, it's true. I think the South African poultry industry, they did give in this instance. The alternative was, we keep these trade barriers, we keep these anti-dumping duties, but we risk losing preferences for the whole agricultural industry, which would have been a much bigger blow to South Africa.
Right then, let's expand this conversation. Daniel Rangers is joining us live in Washington, D.C. Angela Kubler is in Johannesburg as well. Angela, let's start with you. Now that U.S. imports have finally started to come in, have the local poultry farmers resigned themselves to this being the new norm, or are they looking for fresh and different protection from the state?
Well, bottom line here is the poultry industry agreed to that importation of that 65,000 tons. It was their agreement, and essentially they did take one for the local AGOA team. In context, though, South Africa imported around 450,000 tons of poultry last year, so this amount is really very small. The actual import period, by the way, starts on the 1st of April. This phase that we've just gone through was kind of a test run. At this stage, though, Raman, the poultry farmers don't really know what kind of damage this new deal is going to have on them. We don't also have any detail on pricing or who the initial buyer was. That's probably all going to come out in the wash in the next sort of 10 days or so. But it's the farmers' agreement, and they have to live with it. Raman?
Indeed. Daniel, let's lock in some details here. When exactly will this AGOA eligibility review be formally ended?
Well, the U.S. South Africa has taken a decisive step in its agricultural trade policy by restricting imports of U.S. poultry, a move that has sent shockwaves through global trade circles and the American poultry industry. The decision comes after years of tension between South African regulators and U.S. exporters over market access, sanitary standards, pricing practices, and the long-standing dispute surrounding anti-dumping duties on chicken portions. The result is a significant disruption in trade flows, with estimates suggesting the United States could lose up to $450 million in annual export revenue, while South African poultry producers gain renewed protection in their domestic market. For more than a decade, poultry has been one of the most contentious trade items between South Africa and the United States. Chicken is the most affordable and widely consumed source of animal protein in South Africa, making it a politically and economically sensitive commodity. Local producers have repeatedly argued that cheap imports, particularly frozen bone-in chicken portions from the United States, undermine domestic production by flooding the market at prices they claim are below the cost of production. These imports, especially chicken leg quarters, became popular in South Africa because American consumers prefer white meat, leaving dark meat as a surplus product for export. South African poultry farmers and industry groups have long accused U.S. exporters of dumping excess chicken into the local market, harming domestic producers and threatening jobs across the poultry value chain. According to industry data, the poultry sector supports tens of thousands of direct jobs and many more indirectly through feed production, logistics, processing, and retail. Any pressure on local producers is therefore seen not just as a commercial issue, but as a national economic and food security concern. The roots of the dispute stretch back to the early 2000s, when South Africa first imposed anti-dumping duties on U.S. chicken imports. These duties were designed to counteract what South African authorities described as unfair pricing practices. The United States challenged these measures, arguing that the duties were excessive and violated international trade rules. Over time, the disagreement evolved into a broader trade standoff, with poultry becoming a bargaining chip in wider negotiations involving access to South African markets under preferential trade arrangements. In 2015, the two countries reached a temporary compromise under the African Growth and Opportunity Act, commonly known as AGOA. The agreement allowed a quota of U.S. chicken imports to enter South Africa duty-free each year, provided certain conditions were met. In return, South Africa retained its preferential access to the U.S. market for a wide range of exports. While the deal eased tensions temporarily, it did not resolve the underlying disagreements over pricing, health standards, and the impact of imports on local farmers. In recent years, those tensions resurfaced as South African producers renewed calls for stronger protection. Industry representatives argued that rising input costs, including feed, energy, and transport, had made it increasingly difficult for local farmers to compete with imported poultry. They also raised concerns about biosecurity, pointing to outbreaks of avian influenza and the need to protect domestic flocks from imported disease risks. These arguments gained traction with policymakers, particularly in a context of high unemployment, economic pressure, and growing emphasis on local industrial development. The latest restrictions on U.S. chicken imports reflect this shifting policy environment. South African authorities have emphasized the need to prioritize local production, safeguard jobs, and ensure food security. By tightening import conditions and limiting access for U.S. poultry, the government has effectively tilted the balance in favor of domestic producers. For American exporters, the impact is immediate and costly. South Africa has historically been one of the largest markets for U.S. poultry exports on the African continent, absorbing hundreds of thousands of tons of chicken each year. The estimated $450 million loss reflects not only reduced export volumes, but also lost opportunities in a growing consumer market. South Africa's population exceeds 60 million, and demand for affordable protein continues to rise. Losing access to such a market represents a significant setback for U.S. poultry producers, particularly those specializing in dark meat exports. Industry groups in the United States have warned that reduced exports could lead to oversupply at home, downward pressure on prices, and financial strain for producers already dealing with volatile feed costs and global competition. From the South African perspective, the move has been welcomed by local farmers and industry bodies. Poultry associations have described the decision as a victory for fair trade and local production. They argue that reducing import pressure will allow domestic producers to stabilize prices, invest in expansion, and improve biosecurity measures. Supporters of the policy also point to the broader economic benefits, including job preservation and the strengthening of local value chains. The government has framed the decision as part of a broader strategy to promote industrialization and reduce reliance on imports. Agriculture plays a central role in South Africa's development plans, particularly in rural areas where employment opportunities are limited. By supporting domestic poultry production, authorities aim to stimulate rural economies, enhance food security, and reduce the country's trade deficit. The poultry sector, due to its scale and accessibility, is seen as a key driver of these goals. Critics, however, warn that restricting imports could have unintended consequences for consumers. Imported U.S. chicken has traditionally been cheaper than locally produced alternatives, especially for low-income households. Any reduction in supply could lead to higher prices, putting pressure on household budgets at a time when many South Africans are already struggling with the cost of living. Consumer groups have cautioned that protectionist measures must be carefully balanced to avoid harming those most dependent on affordable food. There are also concerns about compliance with international trade rules. The United States has historically been quick to challenge trade barriers it views as unjustified. While South Africa maintains that its actions are consistent with World Trade Organization rules and based on legitimate health and economic considerations, the potential for renewed trade disputes remains. Such disputes could extend beyond poultry, affecting broader trade relations between the two countries. The decision also fits into a wider global trend of countries reassessing their trade dependencies. In recent years, many governments have placed greater emphasis on self-sufficiency, supply chain resilience, and domestic production. The COVID-19 pandemic, geopolitical tensions, and disruptions to global trade have reinforced the perception that reliance on imports can be risky. South Africa's move reflects this shifting mindset, particularly in sectors deemed critical to food security. For the United States, the loss of the South African market highlights the challenges facing agricultural exporters in an increasingly fragmented trade environment. Competition from other poultry exporting countries, changing consumer preferences, and stricter import regulations are all reshaping global trade flows. U.S. producers may seek alternative markets in Asia, the Middle East, or other parts of Africa, but replacing a market as large and established as South Africa will not be easy. The situation also underscores the complexity of trade relationships between developed and developing economies. While the United States emphasizes free trade and market access, countries like South Africa are under pressure to protect local industries and address domestic socioeconomic challenges. Balancing these competing priorities is a persistent challenge in international trade policy. In the longer term, the outcome of South Africa's decision will depend on how effectively domestic producers can meet local demand without significantly raising prices. If local production expands and efficiencies improve, the policy could strengthen the poultry sector and deliver lasting benefits. If, however, supply constraints lead to shortages or price spikes, public pressure could force policymakers to reconsider. The response from U.S. industry and policymakers will also shape the next phase of the relationship. Diplomatic engagement, negotiations over quotas or standards, and potential legal challenges are all possible avenues. The poultry dispute could become part of broader discussions about trade, investment, and economic cooperation between the two countries. Ultimately, South Africa's move to restrict U.S. chicken imports represents more than a single trade decision. It reflects deeper questions about economic sovereignty, development priorities, and the future of global trade. For South African farmers, it is a moment of relief and opportunity. For American exporters, it is a costly setback and a reminder of the shifting dynamics in international markets. As both sides navigate the consequences, the episode stands as a clear example of how food, trade, and politics are increasingly intertwined in a changing global economy. If you care about real African stories and global impact, subscribe to this channel. Africa Press Room brings you informed, in-depth stories that matter. Stay connected, stay informed.